Hello, brothers, sisters, and friends, and welcome to You Are the Current Resident podcast. This is the official podcast of the National Association of Letter Carriers, the union that represents 280,000 active and retired city letter carriers employed by the United States Postal Service. I'm Ed Morgan, and today we're doing things a little bit different. 2 weeks ago in our Leadership Academy Week 3 class, as always, we had Jim Sauber come out and do a class on the history of collective bargaining. And we got a lot of good feedback from the class, and they thought that we should put a podcast out, especially during the tentative agreement and the voting on that, just to kind of give you a history of collective bargaining, what we've been through the years, and what obstacles and other things that we're facing in this collective bargaining time. So we have on today Emeritus Chief of Staff, Jim Sauber. Hey, Jim, thank you for coming on.
It's great to be here. Thanks, Ed.
Can you give us a little bit of a biography about what you've done with the NALC and the Postal Service?
Sure. Yeah, I grew up in Michigan, outside of Detroit. I'm from a family of auto workers. So I've been around the labor movement most of my life. Unfortunately, because of my dad's local, I was able to go to the University of Michigan, where I studied labor economics. And I pretty much spent most of my career with NALC. I was hired in 1985 as a research economist. And over the years, I served as the director of research. And then for 16 years, I was chief of staff, first to President Bill Young and then to President Fred Rolando. I retired at the end of 2022. But I have stayed on as a contractor to help out on special projects, which I really feel really a great deal of satisfaction to be able to continue my role with NALC in whatever way I can. And I just want to thank all the members for the really great working life that I got in this great union. And it's really a pleasure to be with you today.
Thank you. So this is our 15th round of collecting bargaining. Can you give us the big picture from where we started to where we are now?
Well, yeah. I mean, the modern history of the NALC, of course, started with the 1970 strike. Up to that point, what we always refer to it inside the NALC was we lived under a regime of collective begging. Between 1889 and 1970, the only way letter carriers could ever get a raise or any kind of improvement in their working conditions was to basically go hat in hand to the United States Congress and basically lobby for it. And that's what the union, for a good chunk of its history, we were kind of a lobbying operation. And it was very difficult. There are oftentimes, there would be almost decades that would go by between pay increases. Politicians in general were very reluctant to raise pay and made the working conditions and the standard of living for letter carriers really suffered as a result. Thanks to the strike, we won collective bargaining rights in 1970. And so we moved from collective begging to collective bargaining. Or as you mentioned, this is a 16th round of bargaining. We've had 15 completed rounds, and then depending on what happens with this tentative agreement, we'll have finished the 16th contract. And over that period, it's been a huge variety of different environments. But the one constant has been that we have the right to sit across the table from management and have a say in our pay and working conditions, and that's just it's been a huge benefit for letter carriers and other postal workers.
Can you explain the interest arbitration process to us?
Sure. Let me just step back and just say, under the Postal Reorganization Act, which is the legislation that really kind of created the modern postal service, we went from being a taxpayer supported government agency to being a self-supporting. Essentially, it was initially set up as kind of a nonprofit corporation, but under that legislation, postal workers for the first time were covered by private sector labor law, the National Labor Relations Act. But the big difference was that unlike private sector workers and employers, if they couldn't get an agreement in collective bargaining, the workers either had a choice to go on strike, or even sometimes management would lock out the workers to try to force changes in these agreements. So after the strike, Congress really never wanted to have that kind of disruption again. So the one key difference under the NLRA is that we have binding interest arbitration. So it's quite kind of unique in the federal government. It basically, many of our listeners know about rights arbitration, where you have an arbitration over what the meaning of our contract is. In interest arbitration, it's actually a battle over what's in the contract, the contents of the contract, the provisions of the contract. So under our system, it's a tripartite system, meaning that the union gets to name an arbitrator, postal management gets to name an arbitrator, and together they choose a neutral chairman of the arbitration board to hear the case that's presented to them. So under the law, basically every provision of the contract is subject to change in the interest arbitration process. And basically either party can make any kind of proposal to change any provision of the contract. So it can be quite dramatic, have quite dramatic effects on our national agreements. And so if you got to go into it with your eyes wide open, because it's kind of risky in that, you can win and you can lose. And so, but it is also in a time when most unions, the power of the strike has been diminished over time, as there's been a lot of negative court decisions that have really weakened the right to strike in the United States. This process actually gives us a real chance to make our case on the merits before a neutral chairman. So it's a pretty unique process. I think out of the 16 rounds of bargaining, we've had 6 of them have gone to interest arbitration. So it's not an unusual thing. That then in the course of my career, I've been involved in just about every one since the 1991 Mittenthal arbitration, and I'm a big fan of the process. I think it gives workers a real shot at making their case on the merits.
Can we get into COLAs now? And can you explain what they are? There's been a lot of talk among the membership about COLAs and exactly what they are. So if you could get detailed into that, I'd appreciate it.
Sure. Yeah, the COLA provision of our contract has been extremely important to us. In fact, more than half of all the wage increases that we've ever negotiated have come out of our COLA clause. These cost of living adjustments, it's actually an innovation that was invented by the UAW, my dad's union, back in the 1940s. And there was a time in which almost every union contractor in the country had a COLA clause. I think at one point, about 60% of contracts, just in the modern history of the Postal Service, there was a time in the early 90s where 60% of contracts had COLA clauses. Over time, they kind of fell out of favor, but the NALC has always held on to our COLA, and I think strategically it's made all the difference in the world. Basically, our COLA is based on movements in the consumer price index, and we basically get about 55 to 60% of any increase in inflation is covered just by the cost of living adjustments that we have. We get these adjustments twice a year. It's been that way since the early 70s, and it's been incredibly valuable to us just over time. Like I said, half of our increases have come from them, but it really protects you against these unforeseen events like we've just been through. In the wake of the COVID-19 pandemic, there was a huge surge of inflation that nobody anticipated, back when the 2019 contract was being settled. And thank goodness we had it, because I think over $10,000 annually in raises for our top step carriers, about 6,500 of it came from the COLA clause. And so it's something that just about every union president, in the history of the NALC has had a high priority of maintaining the COLA. And it's been a real battle because the Postal Service over the years has tried multiple times to get rid of the COLA clause or to change it, to reduce the formula we use. We have a very good formula based on a 1967 version of the COLA, of the CPI rather. And many unions they have a much less generous COLA formula that maybe covers 20 or 25% of inflation. And we've maintained a high quality COLA all these years. And so I think that's always been a key strategic goal of every round of bargaining, is to maintain that COLA. The Postal Service has tried almost in every arbitration we've ever had. They've tried to either eliminate the COLA altogether or to change it pretty dramatically, either change the formula to make it less generous, or they've tried in a couple of periods in the 1990s, they tried to put like a trigger factor into it, which would have meant that no COLAs would be paid unless inflation got up over 4% or over 3%. And that's a common thing. A good example of that is the United Parcel Service contract. The UPS drivers have a COLA clause in their contract, but it only is paid once inflation exceeds 3%. So that's had a huge dramatic difference between their contract and ours. And I just looked it up. Since 2012, NALC has gotten about $15,000 annually in COLAs as a result of our COLA clause. During that same period, UPS got about 2,500. So it's like a huge difference in payouts. And so when you compare contracts, it's important to really take into account the total amount of COLAs versus general wage increases.
When we talk about collective bargaining, can you talk about the impact that it's had on the NALC and our members?
Sure. I mean, I think if you just look back from that period when we talked about collective bargaining, it's just been a huge difference between the standard of living that carriers had in the early 1970s versus now, and it's all attributable to our right to collective bargaining. We basically moved from a job that put people as basically working poor. Many big cities in New York City, carriers in the 60s and 70s, early 70s could qualify for welfare benefits. The pay was so low. But winning that strike and winning the right to collective bargaining moved the letter carrier job solidly into the middle class. And I just looking back between 1971 and 2023, thanks to collective bargaining, there were 140 separate wage increases negotiated over the last 53 years. There were 56 general increases. There were 82 cost of living adjustments and 2 pay upgrades. And we only had 1 year in that whole period in which we didn't get at least one wage increase. And that came out of back in 2012 when, during the Great Recession, as a result of the DOS arbitration, we actually had a year, basically a wage freeze for a year. But in every other year, we've had at least one general increase and usually one general increase and 2 COLAs. So a typical year for most of our history, there have been 3 increases a year. And that's just very unusual, not only among American workers in general, but even among unionized workers to have such a steady set of increases over time. And that's allowed us to maintain the purchasing power of our wages at a time when a lot of working class people lost ground as the economy has become more and more unequal over time. So having that right to bargain it's just made all the difference in the world. I just give you a real sense of it. If you look back at the time of the 1970 postal strike, the letter carriers were part of the general schedule of the federal government, and we were GS5 employees, so general schedule grade 5 employees. And at the time, we made the same pay as other GS5 employees of the federal government. And if you look what's happened over that history, if you look at the top step now of GS5 federal employees, their annual salary is $49,000 just a little over $49,000 annually. Our top step, thanks to collective bargaining, is $75,000 and $75,299. Obviously, this is before the tentative agreement. So that sort of sums up really the power and value of collective bargaining. The annual difference in pay is nearly $25,000 annually. It's a 50% improvement in pay versus our pre-bargaining history. Now, of course, the federal government does have locality pay in some of the biggest cities, but even after you take that into account, for example, in San Francisco, letter carriers make $15,000 more annually than the top step of grade 5 for the rest of the federal government. The difference in New York is $18,000 annually, and the difference in Boston is $20,000 annually. So even when you take into account locality pay, you can see the ability to negotiate your wages and to have collective bargaining has just made a huge difference in the standard of living of letter carriers all across the country. But then, and that doesn't count all the other benefits of collective bargaining. The fact that you have an empowered voice in the workplace, where workers can, if they have a grievance with their managers or their supervisors, that they have a right to union representation and they have due process rights. And that doesn't count all the improvements in overtime and penalty overtime and in work hour guarantees, scheduling, all the sort of things that we now take for granted in our contract have all developed over 5 decades of collective bargaining, and it's had a tremendously positive effect for our members and our union.
A lot of good stuff there, Jim. So we'll get into the comparability debate, and I know that's been around a lot on social media. Can you talk about the structure and how we get to that point and what comparability means?
Sure. I mean, that's as a famous arbitrator once said, that comparability is like beauty. It's in the eye of the beholder. And it's always been a huge debate in our collective bargaining. It's really a core of collective bargaining is what does that mean? And the reason it's important is that it's actually built into the Postal Reorganization Act. The Postal Service was given a mandate in that law that it should pay its workers, comparable compensation to comparable levels of work in the private sector. So it sounds simple, but it's actually a quite complicated debate. But in over time, in the first few rounds of bargaining, the parties kind of just agreed that we should be paid like other large unionized workforces in the country. But by the time, by the end of the 1970s, there was a huge gap opened up between the Postal Service and its unions about what does comparability mean. And for us, we had traditionally looked at comparable unionized jobs, and the Postal Service over time shifted over towards looking at comparable workers in terms of the characteristics of workers, how much education they had, training, tenure, that sort of thing. And so when we started there was a period of time between 1984 and 1999 where almost every contract went to interest arbitration, and it was all over this fight over comparability. So initially, we actually lost the argument in the 1984 interest arbitration with Clark Kerr. He concluded the Postal Service claimed that they were that basically letter carriers and other postal employees were overpaid compared to comparable workers. And Clark Kerr agreed and called for a period of what he called moderate restraint, meaning he wanted the postal wages to grow more slowly than private sector wages for a while to sort of bring them back in alignment. I mean, we never agreed with that finding, but it did serve as restraint on our wage growth during the 1990s. And since then, since we went to since that time when the Kerr Award came out, we were actually bargaining with the APWU as a joint bargaining committee. And since 1994, we've negotiated our own contracts. And we've never lost that argument since with the interest arbitrator, but it's always something we battle over. So just bringing it to the modern day, I mean, I think most of our members have a very practical, common sense understanding of comparability, and it seems pretty straightforward to us. We think of comparable workers as the package car drivers for United Parcel Service, and that's always been a big part of our argument in interest arbitration. As we look at their wages and our wages, and we've tried to keep within striking distance of their pay levels. But even that can be even when we get into arbitration, even if the Postal Service will engage on our definition of comparability, they often will point to other delivery workers, mainly FedEx, which essentially use contract workers, or Amazon. Increasingly, Amazon's now the largest delivery workforce in the country. They're non-union. They work for small little contractors, and their pay is much lower than letter carriers and the Postal Service employees. So it's a very important issue. It gets arbitrated every single time. There are certain issues in arbitration that always come up, and that's one of them. What is the comparability standard being complied with? And so both parties invest a lot of energy and effort to make their case on that issue.
Can you get into the changes to the workforce structure that we've gotten through collective bargaining and interest arbitration?
Sure, that's another big issue that comes up, is the structure of our workforce. And you go look at the whole history of interest arbitration. It's one of the central issues. Initially, even before postal reorganization, there was always a small non-career workforce employed by the Postal Service, which used to be known as casual employees. That practice goes back 100 years. But once we had a collective bargaining rights, and we sort of formalized the structures of our bargaining unit. This is something that's always been in flux. Initially, casuals. I think we had a 5% limit on casuals for most of the 1970s. But when we got in the 1980s, the Postal Service, especially during periods of financial stress, they looked to save money by raising the percentage of non-union, non-career employees, and it's come up over and over again. First, in the early 1990s, when we were going through a major automation program, when we switched over to delivery point sequencing, there was a push by the Postal Service, knowing that they were going to be able to, after automation, use fewer letter carriers and have fewer routes. They really pushed to create what was called transitional employees, TEs. And that was the central fight of the 1991 interest arbitration before Richard Mittenthal. And it was a period a lot like we've experienced in recent years. There was a period when the Congress was putting huge obligations on the Postal Service to eliminate indirect subsidies to the Postal Service. And so it created big financial losses, and that led the Postal Service to try to create these TEs. We lost initially in the 1991 arbitration, and eventually, but we spent the next 10 years gradually getting rid of them, trying to get rid of the TEs, which we eventually was successful in doing. But then, those same pressures returned. And so there was a new fight in the mid-aughts. We had a huge fight on contract delivery service. The Postal Service started outsourcing new delivery to these, what they call contract delivery service. And it really spread like wildfire in 2004, 5, and 6. And the union, really went on a big campaign, both legislatively and in collective bargaining, to try to fight back, and eventually won that battle to get rid of contract delivery service. And then, of course, more recently, that everyone's aware of, is we've had the creation of city carrier assistance. And this came at a period of, at the time of the Great Recession in 2008, 2009. It was just a devastating period financially for the Postal Service. We lost 30% of our mail volume, because that recession really struck at the heart of the mail-generating parts of the economy. It was real estate and banking, people who were big, heavy users of the mail. And almost within a few years, we lost 30% of our volume, and it created huge financial losses. And that's when it's very difficult to be in interest arbitration, because a big part of what the Postal Service will argue before an arbitrator is that they just don't have the ability to pay wage increases when they're losing money like they were at that time. And so as a result, we went from about 3.5% casuals at the time to about 20% CCAs as a result of the DOS award. And so that was a big, and that's really that creation and what to do about it has really been the main focus of the last 3 rounds of bargaining, including the one that's still pending right now, is what should be, how many CCAs there should be, what should be their pay, et cetera. So these workforce structure issues are they're very tricky, and they're at the core of almost every round of bargaining. And then layered on all that, there's always this huge function of push for flexibility, what percentage should be part-time, what percentage should be full-time. And, depending on the operational needs of the Postal Service, they'll argue for arbitrators to give them more flexibility. The unions pushes back, to try to make sure that people have, jobs where their hours are predictable, they can build, handle their family life and balance their needs of their families with their work lives. So workforce structure is always an incredibly important, not only a cost factor for the Postal Service, but a quality of life factor for our members. And that's something that we deal with just in every round of bargaining.
Can you talk about the external forces against the NALC and the Postal Service over the last 20 years? I know you just mentioned the PAEA and the recession. Can you just get into that a little bit more?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, the period since the 2011 contract was determined, it actually we didn't resolve that arbitration with the DOS panel until early 2013. But now we've kind of referred to this as the era of crisis bargaining. The Postal Service has been in a huge, financial bind. Really, partially it was kind of created by Congress as a result of the PAEA. That's when, as part of that legislation, Congress required the Postal Service to start pre-funding future retiree health benefits. Basically funding retiree health as if it were a pension. Basically, that's not done in any other sector of the economy. It's not. No other federal workers do it. No private sector workers are required to do it under ERISA or anything like that. And it had a huge negative effect on the Postal Service, really every year up until 2021 when we finally got it repealed. But it was basically a $5.5 billion hit every year on the Postal Service, and it was put in place at the very same time that basically the floor of the economy dropped out with the Great Recession. So it was sort of a perfect storm of financial crisis, and that really has a big impact on what happens in bargaining and certainly what happens in interest arbitration. But it's really been a period. I mean, for about between 2012 or 2007 and 2021, about 85% of all the Postal Service's financial losses could be attributed to the pre-funding battle, which is just an external factor that really set the table in a bad way for us and for the last three contracts. And so, unfortunately, right at the end, right when we finally got out from underneath the pre-funding burden, we got just slammed by the COVID-19 pandemic. So that's this period. It was framed with two of the worst recessions in history, and we lost another 20% of our volume as a result of the COVID pandemic. So it's just whenever you're in bargaining, you're at the mercy of what's happening in the labor market and the economy as a whole, and that makes collective bargaining a real challenge. And I don't think there's ever been a period in our history more challenging than the last three or four contracts have been. And in some ways, it's when the union is at its best, because you have to realize without collective bargaining, and this happened all over the economy when these recessions hit. Workers, they not only lost jobs, but they lost. They took pay cuts. They lost their pensions. They lost health benefit contributions. And when you have a union there to fight back and to limit, to limit the losses in tough times and to make improvements and recover as times get better, that's why it's so important to have that right to collective bargaining. It gives you a way to respond to these challenging conditions.
Can you get into the transformational change of the Postal Service with the Delivering for America plan and the loss of mail volume and how they're adapting?
Yeah, I mean, the Postal Service, throughout its history, it's actually had to constantly change. If you look at the long sweep of history, when the Post Office Department was initially set up in our country, this year and next year in 2025 is going to be the 250th anniversary of the Post Office. Its initial role was largely as a communications network. It was a pre-telegraph, pre-telephone world. in which people's main source of communications was through letter mail, and that gradually evolved. By the end of the 19th century, 20th as the 20th century came about, the Postal Service became more and more, especially as technology changed, became more and more of a business services kind of utility almost. We became a key part of the financial system. People paid their bills through the mail. Tens of, trillions of dollars in payments would go through the mail routinely for mortgages and car payments and utility bills. And as particularly later in the 20th century, the Postal Service became a major marketing channel for advertisers. This is a very cost-effective, very lucrative way to generate business for companies. And so by the end, by the end of the 20th century, there was very little personal communications going on, but a lot of business was going through mail. And then with the arrival of the internet in the 21st century, that's all changing again. And little by little, virtually all the financial mail and the payments mail has been drifting out of the Postal Service. We still do quite a lot. Tens of billions of dollars go through the mail every day. But there's just been a general move towards electronic substitution. Fortunately, the flip side of that is that the internet also really created an absolute boom in the e-commerce sector and package delivery. And so the Postal Service, that's what we're in the midst of right now. That's what this Delivering for America plan really is about. Is it's reflecting the fact that our letter mail volume is down by about 50%. Our package volume is up almost 200%. I think in 2012, marketing mail became the single largest volume. First class mail stopped being our largest volume of mail. And then in 2019, the largest source of revenue for the Postal Service is now shipping and packages. And we're up to about $35 or $36 billion a year in package revenue. So we're in this huge change. The Postal Service's network of processing and sorting plants were really built for an age of letter mail. And so they have a huge excess capacity for letter mail sorting and processing, and they need to build capacity for package sorting and processing. And that's what these sort and delivery centers are all about, is shifting to adapt our network to this new reality, is that we have a much more varied mix of mail now. We have a lot of marketing mail, still a good chunk of first-class mail, but a huge surge in packages, and that's where the industry is going. And so this makes bargaining actually for both sides, both for management and for the postal unions. We're all adapting to these changes as we negotiate new contracts, and it's a huge, complicated, and difficult transition that we're going through. But again, it's so valuable for postal workers to have unions at the table to kind of manage these difficult times.
Talking about those difficult times, can you just get in a little bit, the victories and some of the reasons why it's important that we had the NALC negotiating and the collective bargaining in these times?
Yeah, I mean, I look back, going back during both during the Great Recession, and the pandemic. You can either just looking at other unions, there's been a lot. They really went through incredibly difficult times. I think of my dad's union, the UAW. They had just an incredibly difficult period in which the two of the main big three automakers went into bankruptcy. The UAW lost their COLAs as a result of that. They had two-tier wage schedules, implemented as a result of the auto restructuring during the Obama years. They basically had to take over the financial responsibility for retiree health. The big three auto workers, basically transferred that obligation to the unions, essentially. And the unions actually have managed it really quite well. So even for unionized workers, it's been a difficult period. And I think in that context, the NALC did very well during this period of crisis bargaining. I think, President Orlando had probably the three most challenging contracts in our history. But even if you look at, we took our hits in the DOS award. That's when we got the huge CCA workforce. But we fought off, thanks to having a union and thanks for having the ability to argue for it in interest arbitration. We avoided a pure two-tier, where you have lower starting pay and lower top pay. We essentially came out of the DOS award with the basically emerging two-tier, meaning they lowered the starting pay, but we maintained the top pay. And that at the end, when people reach top pay, it doesn't matter when you were hired, you still have that same top pay. That was a huge victory for us, not only because it raises career earnings for our members, but also it maintains the value of their pension benefits, their retirement income, et cetera. So even during tough times, sometimes it's during tough times when the union is most valuable. Even when there's painful hits that we've taken, we have the ability to kind of roll back, and we've been doing that ever since. Since the DOS award, we've been slowly raising CCA pay, and we got to the point where we have automatic conversions. We've got better health benefits for CCAs. We even got this, agreement that we've used for the all-career workforce model in certain cities. We've actually reduced the number of CCAs from about 40,000 down to 28,000, and I know the current leadership wants to keep making progress on that, so eventually get back to where we're an all-career workforce. But this is, sometimes it's hard to see it when you're going through these painful times. But just from the vantage point of my long career, I feel like unions really, really earned their stripes during the tough times. And I think back during the COVID crisis, there's so much to be proud of for our members, the way they stepped up and served the country and helped us get through a really rough time when everybody was sheltering at home, delivering goods, delivering public health information for the CDC, delivering masks, and testing kits. But I also think of how proud we should be as a union, that how we just mobilized to protect our members, and to really restructure the way the work was done during the COVID pandemic, and really served our members well. And as a result, our members served the country so well.
Okay, we gave everyone a lot of history here about collective bargaining. That's what the class is. But, most of our members want to know, what about me and what about this collective bargaining agreement?
Sure. It's really up to the members, and whatever the members decide is going to be their decision. I just tell you a bit about what I've been doing in this round of bargaining as a consultant for the union. I was brought in to help prepare for interest arbitration, which is kind of unique in our way of bargaining, is that every round of bargaining, you have to essentially prepare for interest arbitration even as you're bargaining. So because you don't know if you're going to get an agreement. And so I came in working with our law firm in New York, Cohen, Weiss and Simon, which is really the preeminent labor law firm in the country. And we've worked together, on 6 different arbitrations that I've worked with them on, and they're the best. But we had to build our case, not knowing whether or not we would reach a tentative agreement, and that was my focus on it. So we basically, what that means is you basically recruit experts, and during interest arbitration. It's sort of like a legal proceeding, and there's like it looks a lot like a court case. You have panels of lawyers who call witnesses and experts, and they offer testimony and present data, and offer formal exhibits. And then the lawyers, take turns examining and cross-examining the witnesses. Well, that's what I've been working on in this round of bargaining, is hiring witnesses, a whole slew of economists, to talk about, the various issues that you have to battle over. And we mentioned them earlier: comparability, what's happening in the labor market, what other comparable workers are getting. But we also, found labor historians to help us deal with situations like this, a couple of sociologists that have been working on the delivery industry in particular, heat safety experts, et cetera. And meanwhile, while we're getting all this professional experts lined up, we're all the staff of the NALC, and we have this extraordinary group of letter carrier staffers up in Washington, who put together panels of letter carriers to testify on all sorts of issues. So we'll have panels of CCAs, we have panels of senior carriers, we'll have people dealing with heat safety problems, we have panels on talking about the difficulties and the unfairness of the way CCAs have been overworked, or we have expert panels on uniforms and the rising cost of uniforms. All that has to be put together, really, even as you're negotiating, and that's what we've done. And basically, whatever the members decide in this ratification vote, if they decide to accept this agreement, that's great. Then my work on that will be done. But if not, we are ready to go to interest arbitration if that's what the members decide they want us to do. And so I have to say that this round of bargaining is really quite unique in that in some ways the macroeconomic environment for workers are probably coming out of the pandemic was probably never better. There was a real reset in the labor market, particularly for workers like ours, people who work in person, doing physical labor, and can't work remotely like you did during the, there were a lot of unions made real strong gains. I think of the auto workers, they've recovered a lot of those huge concessions they had to make during the Great Recession when the auto rescue during the Obama administration. And so the union contracts have been very strong. UPS got a very strong agreement because they had a very credible, threat to strike. They got really big increases because they didn't have the COLA clause that we did. And so if you just looked around what was happening in the labor market, this would be a great time to go to interest arbitration. But on the flip side is we probably never, the Postal Service is at among its weakest points in its history financially. They've had very big losses even after we got rid of the pre-funding burden in 2021. They've had two really tough years coming out of the pandemic because of the huge surge in inflation. So they had a $6.5 billion loss in 2023 and a $9.5 billion loss in 2024. So it makes for a very challenging environment. But whatever the union needs, if the members decide they want to try to do better in interest arbitration, the union will go forward, just like it always has, to put on the best possible case that we can. And I think that's what the members can expect from us, and we'll do whatever it takes.
All right, Jim, thank you for your time today. I just want to remind everybody from the ballot committee and what their words were. If you haven't received your ballot yet, make sure you make a phone call to NALC headquarters. NALC headquarters phone number is 202-393-0614, and you can call between 9 a.m. and 4:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Again, that number is 202-393-0614. If you get the answering machine, make sure you leave a message with your full name, your branch, and your phone number so we can make sure you get a call back so that you get your ballot. Ballots need to be in by January 13th. Please, this is part of your union duty. Make sure you do that. Jim, while I have you here, I'd be remiss if we didn't talk about the big win that the NALC had on HR 82. I know prior to you retiring, you had a lot to do with this getting off the ground. Do you just want to talk about it for a little bit?
Sure, I'd be happy to. It was really a great victory. I was laughing. I was talking to an old friend that used to work, for the mail handlers union, and we were talking about how we started lobbying this issue together when he worked at the NALC back in the late 80s. I can remember going up and lobbying a guy who was then the staff director for the Senate Finance Committee, which had jurisdiction over Social Security benefits. And he's now on television every night. He's Lawrence O'Donnell from MSNBC. And we lobbied him to try to, that was within a few years of when those changes to the Social Security law happened. I mean, we were trying to get these provisions repealed. Let's just kind of go over what they are. The government pension offset basically eliminates spousal benefits for letter carriers who would normally get payments as spouses or as a survivor if they were married to somebody who worked in the private sector under Social Security. And for letter carriers hired under the civil service retirement system, they were not getting credit for Social Security. So that government pension offset came in 1977 and basically wiped out spousal benefits for most people, or reduce them, or sometimes eliminate all of the benefits. Then in 1983, under a really unfair kind of characterization, this Congress adopted a bunch of amendments to the Social Security Act, and one of the provisions was something called the windfall elimination provision. And the name kind of gives you where the unfairness of it. They called it a windfall, that somehow letter carriers collecting benefits on their own work record as private sector workers under Social Security employment, either before they were letter carriers or after they retired, they worked in the private sector. In many cases, even with second jobs that they had while they were working as letter carriers, they earned Social Security credits. But Congress was, considered that double dipping. They called it a windfall, that postal employees were getting both a CSRS benefit and a Social Security benefit. And our complaint all along was, well, wait a minute, there's, private sector workers get pensions too, and their Social Security benefits are not reduced if they, because they get this private pension. And we just didn't think it was fair to do that to CSRS retirees. So that windfall elimination provision and the GPO had been really a thorn in our side for more than 30 years. And now with the HR 82 being signed into law, that Social Security Fairness Act, which it took decades of organizing and lobbying, and all thanks goes to the members who got their members of Congress to sign on, got over that filibuster threshold in the Senate, and convinced, basically 2/3 of both houses of Congress eventually supported the repeal of these provisions. And so now going forward, all our members receiving CSRS benefits are going to get an increase in their Social Security benefits going forward. And so it's just a huge victory. I think the total figure was $196 billion over the next 10 years will now be paid out in Social Security benefits that would have been eliminated otherwise. So it's just a tribute to the perseverance of the union and having that voice on Capitol Hill. So thanks to all the members who helped and contributed to the letter carrier political fund and did the kind of grassroots lobbying it takes to get a big change like that made.
Said it perfectly there. Bipartisanship, and everyone always asks, who does our money go to, and where does our grassroots efforts go to? And it went to both sides of the aisle on this one. So big win for the union. Big win for our retirees and the NALC.
Right.
Our union in action there.
Yep.
Thanks for all your efforts, Jim.
Yeah, it's my pleasure. It's great to be here with you today. Thanks.
Yep. Okay. And just want to get over a few more things here. I know we had a big increase in the union meetings, people going to union meetings, talking about the tentative agreement. Don't let that be the last union meeting you go to until the next tentative agreement we get. Make sure you get involved in the union, get to your union meetings. I know you have a busy life out there, but digging out 1 hour every month to get to your meeting, it's so important. We can't get things done without people being involved and being educated and informed. So make sure you get to your union meeting. I also want to thank everyone for this year and this season. No one knows how hard letter carriers work unless you've done the job. So for me and the NALC, just thank you for all your hard work and professionalism at the branch level, on your workroom floor, and out on your routes delivering the mail. Nobody does it better than letter carriers, and just want to thank you for that. And make sure you all have a healthy and safe new year. Happy holidays, everybody. And that's the end of the show. Thank you for listening to this episode of You Are the Current Resident. Please subscribe to the podcast so that you don't miss an episode. And please share the podcast with our NALC brothers and sisters. Make sure you follow the NALC on social media, on Facebook, on the app formerly known as Twitter, Instagram, and Threads. You can find links to our accounts in the episode description. On Twitter, you can follow President Renfro at Brian Renfro 19. May your steward be by your side, and may your union have your back. Thanks for listening. Happy New Year, and we'll see you soon.